Good morning. This is Omar Mohammed, and this is our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism. Today, we once again talk about Europe and the UK, and we have a special guest, Mr. Michael Whine. Mr. Whine, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Could you please introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Michael Whine. 37 years ago, I think it was, I was the co-founder of the Community Security Trust in Britain, which is the defence agency of the Jewish community. At the same time, I dealt with defence issues for the Board of Deputies of British Jews, which is the very ancient representative body of the Jewish community. After leaving the CST, I went to work for the World Jewish Congress, and I am now the UK member of a standing commission of the Council of Europe, which advises governments on human rights matters. I inspect government. I'm the government inspector.
It's good to have someone who watches governments. As always, and I have been recording probably over 30 episodes now, I start with one question. What is the definition of anti-Semitism?
Well, somebody once said it was hating Jews more than is necessary, but I think we have to expand on that. I think 1932, 33 to 1945, it was clear what anti-Semitism was. Since then, the matter has become more complicated for a number of reasons. Firstly, because of the emergence of Israel, and the use by some people, not all, but some people, of anti-Zionism as a cloak for anti-Semitism. Secondly, I think with the statements by the Catholic Church and the Vatican removing the charge of deicide from the Jews, it really no longer has a religious dimension, although increasingly we see Islamist anti-Semitism increasing. And lastly, I think there is the emergence, certainly in the last 8 or 9 months, of an anti-Zionist, leftist anti-Semitism. It was always there. The early communists, early socialists were against Zionism because it represented a form of nationalism. But it's returned particularly after October 7th. So it's different things. It has a political dimension, it has a religious dimension, it has a racial dimension, but in essence it is dislike, hatred of Jews, which can be expressed violently, or it can be expressed in writing. So on the internet, for example.
Some speakers, when I asked the question of the definition of anti-Semitism, by the way, some didn't want even to use or to cite the definition, including UN agencies, saying we do not want to use this definition of the ECRI, or they say it's difficult to have a working definition. But definitions are necessary.
Absolutely. If you want to deal with a problem, you have to define it and you have to measure it. Your listeners may not know, but I was one of the drafters of the ECRI definition, or what became the ECRI definition. And they have to understand the history. With the rise in anti-Semitism in the late 1990s, it became clear that the European Union, the European Commission, needed to do something. So they started a survey of anti-Semitism, but increasingly they were hearing from police, from human rights commissions, from those who were monitoring, that it was difficult to define anti-Semitism in that context. They said, 1939 to 45, we knew what anti-Semitism was. Now we don't know. if there's an anti-Semitic or an anti-Israel daubing on the wall opposite a synagogue, is that anti-Semitic or is that anti-Israel? We don't know how to measure. We don't know how to define anti-Semitism. So the European Commission and its monitoring centre asked a number of academics and activists to draft a definition. Well, to cut a long story short, there were many, nearly 30. Some of them were very long. They were very academic. And what the Commission said was, we want a definition that is understood by a policeman on the streets of Plotsk. Something simple. So we gathered together all of these different definitions, and 3 of us went to Vienna to negotiate with the European Union Monitoring Centre, which is the forerunner of the Fundamental Rights Agency. And we finally arrived at the definition, which became the EUMC definition, and then with the advent of the Fundamental Rights Agency, became the FRA and then the IRA definition. 10 years later, IRA took it over. They rearranged the order of the words, but essentially it's the same definition. The point is that it deals with contemporary anti-Semitism. And as I said, sometimes anti-Zionism serves as a cloak for anti-Semitism. In Europe, in the 2020s, to say that you're anti-Jewish is politically difficult, particularly after the Nazi era. So if you say, oh, I'm anti-Israel, it has a slightly softer approach. And so people will say, oh, I'm anti-Israel. But their words, their actions belie that. What they actually mean is they're anti-Semitic. So the IRA definition is the best definition. There have been others put forward, but they're mostly by academics as a reaction to IRA. They weren't asked to do it. They didn't come forward. They had no practical experience. I mean, those of us that actually drafted it and negotiated it were people with practical experience of fighting anti-Semitism. I've spent the last 30-plus years training policemen and prosecutors. That's my main area of work now, not just in the UK, but around Europe for an intergovernmental security agency. I work with the cops. I know what it is they need. I think I know what it is they need. And it's not some academic definition like the Jerusalem definition or some of the others, because the people that wrote it are academics. They don't have the practical experience.
That's correct. Academics are always academics. It's
And I'm not an academic.
Yeah, I'm academic myself. It's sometimes difficult to move from the academic space into the practical space. And when it comes to anti-Semitism, yes, we need the academic perspective, but we also need actionable plans. Yes. And this leads me to the question, because I've already discussed the situation of anti-Semitism among European populations. But since you are in the Council of Europe and you oversee governments, I mean, let's discuss what the European governments are doing to combat anti-Semitism. There is a European Commission coordinator for combating anti-Semitism. Many European countries have their own offices of combating anti-Semitism, except I think in France, it's not a uniquely for combating anti-Semitism. It's a mix of anti-racism, anti-LGBT, but it's not a specific office for anti-Semitism. Is Europe doing enough to combat anti-Semitism, given that, I mean, what we have seen on October 7 says no?
The short answer is no. But what is being done has been more beneficial than if nothing had been done. To compress history, the European Union, the European Commission, its agency, formulated a strategy for combating anti-Semitism. And that requires European Union member states to have a strategy, which can be a standalone strategy, or it can be part of a general anti-racism strategy. It doesn't matter. They also have to appoint a high-level envoy who will act as the mediator between the Jewish community and government, and who will push government, say, the Jewish community says this, this, and this, but you have to respond to that. So that's a very important role, the envoys. And nearly all European Union states now have an envoy. And they are changing legislation as a result of the work of the European Union and the Council of Europe. My own commission publishes advice to governments in the form of general policy recommendations. I chaired the policy working group on anti-Semitism, and we asked governments to take certain actions, and we check that they do. They don't get off the book if they don't. We go back and check. We don't have hard sanctions if they don't, but nevertheless, we can point out that they're failing because if they are members of the Council of Europe, they undertake certain things. So the short answer is that were it not for what has been done in the last 5-10 years, I think the situation might be much worse. We now have every European state virtually recognizing the threat of anti-Semitism and taking some form of action, either because they've modified their legislation or because they've trained their policemen and their prosecutors and the judiciary, because they're educating. It's vital. You've got to educate kids, not just about the Holocaust, the Shoah. You've got to teach them about living Jews, the contribution that Jews are making now even. So with all of these actions, I think the situation is better than it would otherwise have been. The problem is that whilst we've educated governments, we haven't necessarily educated the people. And that's where the gap is, and that's where I think our focus has to be from now on.
Back to the people. In Europe, as well as in the UK, what is the source of anti-Semitism? Is it left? Is it right? Is it Islamic anti-Semitism? Christian anti-Semitism? Who is who in all of this?
It's coming from all different directions. 39 to 45, even up until the 80s, it was coming primarily from the far right, from the fascists, the Nazis, the neo-Nazis, or those who had far-right views. Not necessarily Nazis as well, but people who believed in the supremacy of white Europe. Since then, we've had the advent of Islamist anti-Semitism, and I've written a great deal about this, particularly Ikhwan and Iranian anti-Semitism. And I had seen the influence, particularly of the Ikhwan in European states, particularly after Nasser's crackdown and the escape of Ikhwan leaders, the Muslim Brotherhood leaders, to Turkey and to the UK, to southern Germany as well, to Munich, and their influence on Muslim communities. And of course, particularly in the UK, you've got a parallel organisation to the Ikhwan, which was formed at the same time in the 1920s in India, which has similar views. So the influence of these Islamist ideologies is growing because they're very active. If you look at the most active organizations in Europe, they are often Muslim, but they are often Muslim influenced by Muslim Brotherhood. And then, of course, now also we get it from the left. As I said earlier, the left was always anti-Zionist because it represented a form of nationalism, and they were against nationalism. But we see it now increasingly from left, primarily amongst young people who are often really quite ignorant. They're ignorant about their own history. They're ignorant about the history of their countries. They spout slogans without understanding the meaning of slogans. So it's coming from different directions. It's not just from the Nazis.
And what is the current situation now?
It's difficult. In part, it depends on several factors. Firstly, what happens between Israel and the Palestinians and Hamas, because the war generated a lot of heat in Europe, those opposing Israel. Secondly, it depends on the economic situation. 5 years ago, I would have said our biggest threat is declining economic power. People resented the power of the European Union against their own national states. They felt they'd lost control of their governments, of their futures. So now I think it's a combination of factors. The economy may be improving, certainly in some European countries it is. Britain certainly is, having gone through a very difficult time. But the influence of the Middle East is very important. Also the influence of states, certain malign states, Iran in particular, but Russia as well. We see already the influence of Russia in propaganda, anti-Jewish propaganda, as well as Iran. And I would say probably the biggest terror threat to Jewish communities at the moment is coming equally from far-right activists, but also from Iran and its surrogates.
I often get asked this question by my friends, my Jewish friends, because they know I talk to commissioners on combating anti-Semitism. They say, like, what's the use of these offices? What tools do they have if we still don't feel safe? What is in their hand?
That's a very important question, because often they don't have any tools other than arguments. But they can impress on governments the fact that if anti-Semitism is not dealt with, if it's not combated, it affects the whole of society. It affects democracy. They always say that, they come for the Jews first, but they come for everybody else second and third. So it's a threat to democracy. And that is an important tool that the commissioners, the envoys, have, that they can impress on governments. Often governments are made up of young people, who also don't understand their own history. So one hopes that the envoys have that experience. I'm involved in an Austrian government initiative to train the envoys. They meet annually. The European Conference Against Anti-Semitism is organized by Austria. They took on the role when they had the chairmanship of the European Union. And we bring together all the envoys every year, and we give them a couple of days of education on what's happening, how they can work against it, and so on. So the envoys have a role. I think if they didn't exist, it could be a much worse situation. But they don't have hard sanctions. They don't have strong tools. It's arguments. And laws, they can push governments. The fact is that all governments are supposed to have legislation against anti-Semitism. It's not always called legislation against anti-Semitism. Within the EU, it's the framework decision of 2008 and the Council of Europe additional protocol to the 2012 Cybercrime Convention. But both deal with hate speech against Jews and with Holocaust denial. And governments are required to transpose those two into domestic legislation. There are a few that still haven't done so. And you won't hear about it, and certainly not in America, but those governments that are failing to do so are being brought and being prosecuted before the European Court of Justice.
I assume, and probably my assumption is wrong, but what we were discussing is still Western Europe. But what's the situation in Eastern Europe?
It's very different. I've spent the last 15 years working with COPS in Eastern Europe through the OSCE, which is an intergovernmental security agency, which came about as a result of the Helsinki Accords. Essentially, the collapse of the Soviet Union and all of these governments suddenly becoming independent and having no background in democracy. So there were the soft powers of the OSCE was to train legislators, criminal justice agencies to use democratic means within the law. So essentially, new legislation, training of policemen. Policemen prior to Helsinki were there to protect the state. Now it's a policeman's job to protect the human rights of the individual against the state. Big difference. You have to train policemen. If you're still dealing with an older generation of policemen, it's an uphill struggle. I spent 10 years going to Eastern Germany, training cops in Eastern Germany, because it's a whole new world for them. So, education of criminal justice agency and just education generally. And there's still a long way to go. But Eastern Europe, it's different from Western Europe. You don't have the large Muslim populations. Very few of them have indigenous Muslim populations, and very few, Poland perhaps, has taken in refugees from the Middle East, from Syria, from Afghanistan. So essentially they're dealing with domestic issues rather than external issues brought in. It's different in Eastern Europe. There's still some way behind Western Europe.
Let's go to education. There have been also arguments that is education about the Holocaust is enough to help in reducing anti-Semitism, or we are in need of a whole new set of and mechanisms of education.
You're right. Teaching about dead Jews is one thing. You have to teach them about living Jews. There are still Jews living in Europe, and you have to teach them. I mean, they're amongst us. Sometimes they look different if they're Orthodox, but essentially they are living normal lives. They make a contribution to society, and their history is something that everybody can learn from. So I don't believe in just Holocaust education. I want children taught about living Jews and what they believe and what they think. The Jews themselves believe that they had a mission, if you like, to educate the world, and that mission is not fulfilled. There's a long way to go. So I would not just teach about the Holocaust. I would teach about living Jews.
It's interesting that you mentioned that, because the meaning of the title of the podcast, 36 minutes, is the significance of the number 36 in Judaism, yes, which refers to the 36 righteous men who work, who work on the...
I know, I had an Orthodox Jewish background.
Yes, so, I mean, in that regard, how can we, I mean, beside the education of public, but I think you raised a very important point, is that the security implementers, the security agencies needs to be educated on how to deal with anti-Semitic incidents. And we have seen recently lots of demonstrations where anti-Semitism also happened. What should we do to provide more to educate police, to give them the tools, the necessary tools?
They need a lot of educating, the police. Often they will see a demonstration and they will see pro-Hamas and they will see Jews protesting against Hamas and say, well, we have to give them equal space. They both have a right, and indeed they do have a right to demonstrate, but they have to understand what the ideology of Hamas is and what the ideology of the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, is. It's one of hate. It's one of ascendancy. It's one of wanting to take over the world and of bringing about major problems in order to allow the Muslims to take over. I mean, this isn't Islam. This is the Islamist view. So they have to understand what it is they are policing. And they have to understand that hatred, if it is unchecked, leads to more hatred and then leads to violence. So we have to educate the police to understand what it is that's confronting them on the streets and to work against it. There's laws, as I said. The laws exist now in most European states to deal with this. It's applying the laws. So you don't have just to teach them about the law. You have to teach them how to apply the law.
Recommendations. I mean, you have been working for a very long time on combating anti-Semitism. You have a seasoned experience, and you have contributed a lot in this regard, in the IRA definition, in the security. What are the recommendations that you have, not only for Europe, but also for the United States? Because anti-Semitism in the United States is becoming a major issue as well. But if you allow me to continue the question, there is something missing when we talk about anti-Semitism in Europe, is that can Europe play a role in preparing the ground to start talking about anti-Semitism in the Middle East? Is there a way of doing this?
Important question, because our experience of anti-Semitism is the worst possible. You know, we had the Crusades, when a third of Europe's Jews were murdered by the Crusaders on the way to the Holy Land to liberate it from the Muslims. We had the Shoah, when 6 million Jews were murdered and tens of millions of other people were murdered, all in the name of hate. So we have an experience, and we should use that experience both to legislate against hate, but also to teach, to educate. Look, this is where we come from. This is what we've gone through. This is the mess that we made of the world. We Europeans learn from our mistakes. So this is a very important lesson for America. I have to say that this year, for the second year, I'm coming to the States. I'm training American cops. I've been training British and European cops for years, but the British police are sending me to America to work with American cops because one of the initiatives in Europe is to work or to collaborate with civil society expertise. The police don't have all the answers. There's a lot of expertise within civil society. Also, European legislation puts the victim at the centre of combating crime. It's the Victims Directive 2012. I could bore you for hours on European legislation. So putting the victim at the centre requires certain things. It means collaborating with civil society expertise, drawing on that expertise to enhance the work of the police, prosecution service, and the judiciary. It requires the police to work in a close way. So, for example, in the UK, we have gold strategy troops. If there is an issue, a big issue, with a security dimension, the police will draw together the representatives of each of the communities that they work with and work out the strategy. Silver is tactics and bronze is on the streets. But gold strategy, which police convene, very senior police officers convene these meetings as and when they're needed and bring together representatives. So, for example, in the UK, the CST, the Jewish Defence Agency, has been working for years with Muslim groups. We work very closely with a particular Muslim group. So the two prime candidates for gold strategy groups at the moment are Tel Mama, the Muslim organisation, and CST. And they will sit round a table with senior policemen and work out a strategy for the police to deal with the threats.
Can this be expanded to the Middle East? Can Europe use its own relation with the Middle Eastern countries? They do have delegations in many Middle Eastern countries. I know our focus is Europe, but I always also think about the Middle East because I don't see there is a strategy for anti-Semitism in the Middle East.
There isn't. And I would be wary of imposing European solutions on the Middle East. You're dealing with different mentalities. You're dealing with millenarian ideas, particularly in some parts of the Middle East. European logic, European practice doesn't necessarily work. Nevertheless, doesn't mean you don't try. Certainly religious leaders could be brought together and use that as a basis. Women's groups, for example, very important, very useful women's group in the UK, brought together Muslim women and Jewish women. They could use that in the Middle East. You don't have to have the direct approach. You can go around it. You have to use your imagination.
It's just to start. You start talking about anti-Semitism.
Yes, exactly. But then you're also dealing with Hassan al-Banna and the Islamist ideas, and you have to work against those as well. And remember also the Nazi influences from the 1930s onwards, particularly in Iraq and Syria. So you've got a lot of work. And I wouldn't necessarily transpose European solutions into the Middle East. But with some imagination, you can make a beginning.
That's correct. It's just to start. I've asked this question to the senior advisor of Ambassador Lippstadt, the U.S. envoy to combat anti-Semitism. Yeah. He said they are trying. They are working with Saudi Arabia. They are working with other countries, trying to change the curriculum.
Yeah. I mean, I have a nice story about Saudi Arabia.
We would like to hear it.
I have to be careful what I say because some of my work is not in the public domain. After the Madrid peace talks between Israel and the Arab states, the Jewish community received a discreet inquiry from the Saudi government. And I met the man who subsequently became foreign minister of Saudi Arabia and the then Saudi ambassador to Washington. And I had a series of meetings with them in London and in Washington, the upshot of which was that a delegation of Jewish leaders from the USA and from the UK would be invited to Riyadh to talk to the royal family in Saudi Arabia. We were told that there were younger members of the royal family who didn't share the views of the older generation, and they recognized that Israel was a positive political force, but more importantly, a great economic force in the Middle East, and that Saudi Arabia could benefit from that. So we were all set to go off to Riyadh to meet the Saudi government, and then the first Intifada happened, and all the plans went out of the window. But the initiative came from the Saudi royal family, from younger members of the Saudi royal family.
That's encouraging. We have around 3 minutes left, and I would like to take the advantage of that remaining time to look at the future. Can we talk about solutions?
We have to. If you come into this game, you can't be a pessimist. You have to have some sort of optimistic outlook. There is a solution. You've just got to find it. And you can't be diverted by all the other rubbish that's going on outside. So you have to support the peacemakers. You have to support those people with imagination who are making those connections. In Sweden, there is an initiative in Malmö, an initiative between a Shiite imam and a rabbi, an Israeli rabbi who was sent to Malmö, who have been talking and bringing together elements within their communities for years, despite what's going on in Syria and what's going on in Gaza. They're still talking. I met them recently. So there are breakthroughs. You've just got to work on those breakthroughs and support them and assist them.
The conflict is still ongoing in the region. Do you see, and this is my final question, I promise. Do you see, despite the way that the conflict is going, do you see there is a possibility that people might come out and start talking about, let's start denouncing anti-Semitism, not just talking about criticizing Israel or doing this and doing that, like them taking, you enjoy your right of demonstration, but can you contribute to denouncing anti-Semitism?
I hope so. I think eventually there will be some realization that anti-Semitism in the Middle East is a very, very negative force. It's brought nothing but harm, and that there is more that binds Jews and Muslims than divides them. In my work, I made all my staff read the Quran, with the point being that there was so much in the Quran that had a basis in Tanakh. So I made all my staff, admittedly, a Muslim friend said that the version we were reading was not the best one, but it was the one that I found, the Penguin edition. But nevertheless, I got all my staff to read the Quran.
I mean, I'm a historian, and being optimistic is not part of my thinking, but I still believe it's possible that Muslim and Jews can come together, and I do hope that.
Yes, so do I.
Mr. Mike Whine, thank you very much for your time and your insights.
Thank you.
This was our 36 minutes on anti-Semitism.